The basement had been crying for 3 nights straight, and no one else seemed to hear it. The brownstone on Ashford Street had always been quiet, the kind of building where neighbors exchanged polite nods but never lingered in conversation, where secrets lived comfortably behind locked doors and drawn curtains. But on the 4th night, when the sound became a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, Sarah Chen knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. The thumping, the scraping, the low moan that seemed to travel through the walls like a living thing searching for an exit. She stood in her kitchen at 2 a.m, barefoot on cold tile, listening to something that shouldn't exist. Her apartment sat directly above his, the man in 1B who had moved in 6 months ago, with nothing but boxes labeled in handwriting, too precise to be casual. She'd seen him twice. Once in the narrow hallway where he'd smiled with teeth too white, too straight, and once through her window as he carried something heavy, wrapped in dark plastic, into the building's side entrance. He was ordinary in the way that made you forget faces. Average height, brown hair, a voice that never rose above a whisper. But ordinary men don't keep basements that weep. The decision formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on glass, beautiful and inevitable and dangerous. Sarah pulled on her robe, the silk one her mother had given her before the accident, before everything changed, and walked to her door with hands that trembled despite her resolve. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the fluorescent lights flickering in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, almost alive. She descended the stairs, each step an agreement with fate, each creak of wood a word in a contract she didn't fully understand. His door was different from the others, she noticed now. Darker wood, no peephole, a brass knocker shaped like a closed fist. She raised her hand to knock, and heard it clearly for the first time without walls between them. A voice, female, young, speaking words that dissolved into sobs before they could form meaning. Sarah's breath caught in her throat like a trapped bird. 3 sharp knocks, and the sound below went suddenly, terribly silent. The door opened before the 3rd knock's echo died, and there he stood with that smile, that calm, empty smile that belonged on a mannequin or a mask. His eyes met hers with a warmth that didn't reach deep enough, a performance of friendliness that made her skin crawl in ways she couldn't articulate. Behind him, the apartment was dark except for a single lamp, casting long shadows that moved when nothing should be moving. The air that drifted from his doorway smelled of earth and copper, and something sweet that made her think of funeral flowers. And in that moment, standing on his threshold, Sarah realized she had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. His name was Marcus Bell, or at least that's what the mailbox said, and he invited her inside with a gesture so practiced it seemed choreographed. Sarah's feet refused to cross the threshold, some primal instinct screaming warnings her rational mind tried desperately to ignore. The noise from the basement, she managed to say, her voice smaller than she intended, more vulnerable than she'd ever allowed herself to sound since becoming the woman who lived alone and pretended not to be afraid. Marcus tilted his head, still smiling, and said the words that would haunt her. "There's no one down there. I promise you that." But even as he spoke, even as his lips formed the reassurance, Sarah heard it rising from below like smoke through floorboards. Her name, whispered in a voice that knew her, that recognized something in her she'd buried deep. Not Sarah, not the full formal version, but the nickname only 3 people had ever used, the name her sister called her before the river took her 8 years ago. Sarbear, stretched thin and desperate, climbing up from whatever hell existed beneath his ordinary apartment. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel. Her lungs forgot their purpose, and Marcus's smile never wavered. She stumbled backward, her shoulder hitting the hallway wall hard enough to leave a bruise she'd discover later, examining herself in the mirror like evidence at a crime scene. Marcus watched her retreat with eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and she could have sworn she saw something flicker across his face. Satisfaction, maybe, or anticipation. He didn't follow, didn't call after her, just slowly closed the door with a softness that was somehow more threatening than a slam. The hallway returned to its mundane fluorescence, but Sarah knew with absolute certainty that everything had changed, that she'd glimpsed something that couldn't be unseen. Back in her apartment, she locked every lock, pushed her heaviest chair against the door, and stood trembling in her kitchen as dawn began its slow crawl across her walls. The rational explanations lined themselves up like suspects in an interrogation. exhaustion, stress, the anniversary of her sister's death approaching like a storm she could feel in her bones. But rationality couldn't explain the voice, couldn't dismiss the way Marcus had stood there knowing she heard it, watching her reaction like a scientist observing an experiment. Sleep was impossible now, a luxury for people who hadn't heard the dead speak their name. She made coffee with shaking hands and opened her laptop, the blue light harsh against her tired eyes. Marcus Bell, she typed, watching the cursor blink like a heartbeat. The search results bloomed across her screen. 3 Marcus Bells in the city, none matching her neighbor's face. And one news article from 2 years ago about a Marcus Bell who disappeared without a trace from an apartment in Brooklyn. The photo showed a different man, older, kinder eyes, but the address made Sarah's stomach drop. 1B, in a brownstone on Ashford Street. Her building, his apartment, a man who vanished into thin air, or perhaps into something beneath the ground, where voices went to learn the names of the living. The morning came wrapped in fog, turning Ashford Street into something from a Gothic novel, all gray edges and hidden corners. Sarah hadn't slept, had instead spent the night falling down rabbit holes of missing persons reports and property records, her eyes burning from the screen's glow and the terrible knowledge accumulating like poison. 7 people had disappeared from buildings within a 3-block radius over the past 5 years. All young women, all living alone, all vanishing on nights when neighbors reported hearing strange sounds from basements. The police reports read like fiction, dismissed as runaways or voluntary disappearances, cases that went cold because no one wanted to imagine the alternative. She stood at her window watching Marcus leave for work, or whatever performance of normalcy he enacted each day, his briefcase swinging with each measured step. He looked up, directly at her window as if he'd known she was watching all along, and that smile spread across his face like an infection. Sarah jerked back, her coffee mug slipping from her fingers and shattering across the floor, brown liquid spreading like blood from a wound. When she looked again, he was gone. The street empty except for the fog and a black cat that sat on the steps of his entrance, staring up at her with eyes too intelligent, too knowing. The decision to investigate came not from courage, but from the certainty that waiting meant becoming the next whisper in someone else's wall. Sarah had learned to pick locks in college, a skill from a rebellious phase she'd thought was useless until this moment when it became survival. She waited until noon when the building settled into its midday stillness, when Mrs. Rodriguez went to her sister's house and the Johnsons both left for their office jobs. The hallway was empty, holding its breath as she knelt before Marcus's door with tools that felt like weapons in her trembling hands. The lock gave way easier than it should have, as if the door wanted to be opened, as if the apartment was hungry for visitors. Inside, the darkness was thick enough to taste, a physical presence that pressed against her skin like unwanted hands. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing an apartment that was too empty, too clean, furniture arranged with the precision of a stage set. No photographs, no personal items, nothing that suggested a human being actually lived here rather than merely existed. But there, in the corner, a door she'd seen in the building's blueprints, the basement entrance. The wooden door was old, older than the building itself somehow, carved with symbols Sarah didn't recognize, but that made her head ache when she looked at them too long. The handle was warm under her palm, feverish, alive, and when she turned it, the smell that rose from below was overwhelming. Earth and rot, and that sickly sweet floral scent that now made her think of bodies preserved in gardens. The stairs descended into absolute darkness, and from somewhere in that void, she heard it again, her name, her sister's voice, and beneath it a chorus of others calling names she didn't know, but somehow understood were all that remained of the women who'd disappeared. Sarah stood on the threshold between her old life and whatever truth waited below, knowing that descending meant there might be no return, but also knowing that not descending meant living with ghosts. The stairs groaned under her weight, each step a prayer or a confession. Sarah couldn't tell which anymore. Her flashlight beam bounced off walls that seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched her terrified heartbeat. The basement stretched impossibly far, defying the building's dimensions, a space that existed in violation of physics and reason. Pipes ran along the ceiling like arteries, dripping something dark that wasn't water, and the floor beneath her feet was covered in dirt, though they were in the middle of Brooklyn, 3 stories above subway tunnels and electrical lines. The voices grew louder as she descended. No longer whispers, but full-throated pleas, a choir of the lost begging for recognition, for remembrance, for someone to bear witness to their end. Sarah's sister's voice wove through them all. That familiar laugh turned desperate, and she followed it deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels that shouldn't exist beneath an ordinary brownstone. Her rational mind had shattered somewhere on the 6th step, leaving only instinct and a terrible curiosity that pulled her forward like a rope around her soul. The walls were marked with names carved into the stone. Jennifer Morrison, Alicia Chen, Rebecca Santos, dates spanning decades. Then she found the room. If a room was what you could call a space hollowed from nightmare itself. 7 wooden chairs arranged in a circle, each one occupied by a figure slumped forward, hands bound, heads covered with burlap sacks that moved with shallow breaths. They were alive, barely, kept in some state between death and consciousness, and Sarah's scream died in her throat as she recognized the clothing. The red jacket Jennifer Morrison wore in her missing person photo. The distinctive tattoo on Rebecca Santos's wrist. These weren't just missing women. They were his collection, his audience, kept alive for purposes Sarah's mind refused to comprehend. In the center of the circle sat a chair empty and waiting, newer than the others, the wood still raw and unvarnished. Sarah stumbled backward, her flashlight swinging wildly, and that's when she saw them. Photographs covering every inch of the walls behind the chairs. Hundreds of images of her, taken through windows, on streets. In moments she'd thought were private. Her at the coffee shop, her leaving work, her crying in her apartment on the anniversary of her sister's death. Months of surveillance, maybe years. Every moment of her life observed and cataloged and collected. The empty chair had always been meant for her. Marcus's voice came from the darkness behind her, soft as silk and sharp as razors. "I've been so patient, Sarah, waiting for you to come to me willingly." His footsteps echoed in the impossible space, unhurried, confident, the sound of a predator who'd already won. She ran, her legs finally remembering their purpose. But the tunnels had multiplied, branching like veins, and each turn brought her to another horror. More rooms, more chairs, more women suspended in their living death. The basement was vast, an underground kingdom of suffering, and Sarah was lost in its heart with a monster at her heels, and her dead sister's voice still calling her name, though now she understood it wasn't her sister at all, but a recording, a lure, a trap she'd walked into with eyes wide open. Sarah's lungs burned as she crashed through the darkness, her flashlight dying, casting her into a void punctuated only by Marcus's steady footsteps behind her. The basement had become a maze designed by a malevolent god, each tunnel leading not to escape, but to new chambers of carefully curated horror. She passed rooms filled with belongings, personal items arranged like museum exhibits, shoes lined up by size, jewelry sorted by type, locks of hair in labeled glass jars. This wasn't madness. It was meticulous. A collection maintained with the care of someone who believed deeply in his purpose. Then her foot caught on something, sending her sprawling onto the dirt floor, her palms scraping against stone and bone. Yes, bone, she realized with fresh terror. The tunnel had led her to an ossuary, walls lined with skulls that watched her with empty sockets. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, generations of victims going back further than seemed possible. Marcus's voice floated through the darkness, conversational, almost friendly. "You're thinking too small, Sarah. This isn't about me. It's about what lives here, what's always lived here, feeding on fear and loneliness. And I'm just the keeper, the shepherd who brings it fresh souls." She forced herself up, stumbling forward, and found stairs, different from the ones she'd descended. Older, carved from bedrock. Sarah climbed with desperate strength, her hands bleeding, her breath coming in sobs that sounded too much like prayers. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling upward, and she could hear Marcus ascending behind her, never rushing, always confident. But then light, blessed light, filtering down from above, and a door, heavy wood reinforced with iron, and when she threw herself against it, the door gave way, and she tumbled into darkness. That was different. Warmer, familiar. Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, she realized, the first floor, and the old woman stood in her kitchen staring at Sarah with eyes that held too much knowledge. "You saw," Mrs. Rodriguez said, not a question. And Sarah understood with creeping dread that the entire building knew, that they'd all known, that she'd been selected not randomly, but deliberately by a community that fed its monster to survive. The old woman's face held no malice, only a terrible resignation. It's always someone new, someone alone, someone who won't be missed enough. We're all just trying to survive, you understand. We all have families to protect. Sarah ran, bursting through the apartment door into the hallway where other neighbors now stood in their doorways, watching with those same resigned eyes. Accomplices through silence, survivors through sacrifice. She made it to the street, gasping in afternoon air that tasted like resurrection, and ran until her legs gave out 3 blocks away. When she looked back, the brownstone on Ashford Street looked exactly as it always had. Ordinary, forgettable. Just another building in a city of millions. But she knew what lived beneath it now, what waited in the dark with patient hunger, and she knew that Marcus would be patient too, that she hadn't escaped so much as been released, marked now, forever connected to the thing that called her name in her sister's voice, and would continue calling until she answered. The police station smelled of burnt coffee and bureaucratic indifference, and Detective Morrison listened to Sarah's story with eyes that grew increasingly skeptical. She showed him the photos on her phone, the screenshots of missing persons, the property records, but he looked at her the way you look at someone unstable, someone whose grief has curdled into delusion. He took notes with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions, and when she insisted they search the basement, he promised to send someone by, a promise that sounded like dismissal. Walking out into the harsh sunlight, Sarah understood she was alone in this, that the monster under Ashford Street had survived this long because it was good at making believers look like lunatics. She couldn't go back to her apartment, couldn't even walk past the building without her vision tunneling and her chest constricting. Sarah checked into a hotel downtown, paying cash, using a fake name, survivor's instinct kicking in even as her mind struggled to process what she'd witnessed. But that night, in a room on the 15th floor with the door locked and the windows sealed, she heard it, her name whispered through the air conditioning vent, her sister's voice curling through the metal ducts. The hotel's basement, her mind screamed. Every building has a basement. And perhaps what lived under Ashford Street wasn't confined to one location, but was something larger. A network of darkness connecting beneath the entire city. The next week dissolved into paranoia and research, Sarah barely sleeping, eating only when her hands shook too much to type. She found them. Architectural anomalies in buildings across Brooklyn, all brownstones, all with basements that extended beyond their blueprints, all with histories of disappearances that went back centuries. She found references in old newspapers to the Keeper, a figure that appeared in different eras under different names, always in the same neighborhoods, always collecting the lonely and forgotten. Marcus Bell was just the latest iteration, and when one keeper disappeared, another would take his place, drawn to the darkness like moths to flame, or perhaps created by it. Detective Morrison called on the 8th day, his voice tight. We searched the basement at Ashford Street. Found nothing, just storage and old pipes, but Sarah, Marcus Bell filed a missing person report on you. Says you've been stalking him. He has photos of you outside his building. The world tilted, reality becoming negotiable, and Sarah understood the trap's true brilliance. She'd been turned from witness to perpetrator, from victim to villain, and anything she said now would only tighten the noose. She hung up and looked at her reflection in the hotel mirror, seeing a woman who'd glimpsed too much, who carried knowledge that was both salvation and curse. On the 9th day, Sarah made her decision, packing her few belongings and leaving the hotel before dawn. She couldn't run forever, couldn't hide from something that existed beneath the foundation of every building, that called to her through every vent and pipe and underground space. But she could fight, could warn others, could become the voice that spoke the truth even when nobody wanted to listen. As she walked through Brooklyn's awakening streets, she saw them everywhere now, the keepers, ordinary men and women tending their terrible gardens, and the marked ones. People like her who carried the haunted look of those who'd heard their names whispered in the dark. The brownstone on Ashford Street still stood, and in its basement, she knew, the empty chair waited with patient certainty, because the monster always claimed what it was promised. But Sarah Chen, who'd descended into hell and climbed back out, walked into the sunrise with a story that needed telling, even if the world wasn't ready to believe that sometimes the monsters aren't under the bed, but beneath the very ground we walk on, patient and hungry and eternal, waiting for the lonely to come home.